Hello.
Over to you, Senna.
Really properly. Hi, everybody who's watching. Thank you for tuning in. This is the MEDtalkx podcast, and it's off the shelf. It's our monthly book club. We hold this every. Thank you. We've got Mehran, Javeed, Fahim Chakar, Zubair Patel, and I'm Sana Khan. And are we ready to go to the next slide, Mehran? Thank you. So this monthly book club, for whoever knows, you'll already know, but it's every month and it's at 8 p.m. We try to limit it to an hour, and it happens every last Sunday of the month, and one of us four choose a book. And this week I've picked a book, and we'll go through it in a bit. It's recorded and available on Facebook Live and YouTube Live. Thank you. We've got a couple of rules just to be polite, so we avoid interruptions whilst one person is speaking. We're usually quite good at that. And drink is fine, so obviously we have to have a cup of tea, but avoid food, please. And it's always going to be free. And we try and be punctual, as always, and we avoid flaming. I just learned what that meant a couple of book clubs ago, but it means just be nice to each other. And disagreements are done respectfully. I don't think I've ever seen a really heated disagreement here, but you know, we might see one. It'd be really amazing. And this month book is the ETYMOLOGICON by Mark Forsyth. He's a linguist, he's a lexicographer, and I think it's his first book that he's ever had published. It's all about etymology, really, where words come from and how they link to each other. And it's one of my favorite books. I read it like once a year. So I thought it'd be fun to get the guys involved. And I hope that we're going to have a really interesting chat about it.
Thank you, Sana. It's thank you for the recommendation. It's a really interesting book. It's obviously his first book, isn't it? After he started that Inklyfool blog. So can't wait to get stuck. And I've got my physical copy as evidence.
So, what was your reaction, guys, to the cover and the title of the book? I think I can predict half of that answer. Should I go over to you, Mehran?
Yeah. So when I looked at that book title, I've never come across the word MEDtalogicon or con. I still don't know which way to say it. Yeah. But I guess it was a term coined by John Milton, looking more into it, and you know he's quite a connoisseur when it comes to neologism. So he creates a lot of words, and this is one of the words that he talks about. So I think it's just a book of etymologies, which is just in terms of study of language and understanding its roots. It's a really interesting book. It's 252 pages, so within our kind of informal limitation of book length, so that we can keep it in check. But it's got 111 topics of discussion, which is quite different to all our previous books. So it's a very much it's a non-pathological flight of ideas when you actually read the book. It's just everything is very much interconnected, and it's just quite a quirky book to read. So it's very accessible, and I thought it was quite an interesting book.
Brilliant, thank you. What did you think, Zubair?
Yeah, obviously none of us are linguists here or artists here. We're barely scientists, I guess. So it was good to kind of be tested with a book that maybe made us think differently to how we normally think. Obviously, we use words all the time, but a lot of our professional words are rather technical to our own medical or pharmaceutical world. To be honest with you, I've actually got one of his books already, so this is a book I've not come across of his before. So this is a new one that I've not actually read of his, but I do like his style of writing. I know Mehran's obviously given us his psychiatric opinion, but I just love the fact that this is a blog that's made into a book. I mean, I think that's just the dream, isn't it, for most of us, that we just write random things over the years, and then eventually someone says, actually, that's quite good. Why did it make you into a book and make you into a Times bestseller or whatever in the process? So I think that was the best thing about it for me in that regard, that, you know, slow but steady steps over the years. He's obviously very passionate about it, and that obviously comes through quite strongly in the book. But what I love about the book is that he doesn't really dwell too much and argue. He just says, I've done the work for you. This is it. although others may disagree with him, he just gives his opinion. He doesn't really bother to give others' opinions to a great deal. So I love that part about him, that he was quite unapologetic about that aspect. But no, as Mehran mentioned, it was within our attention span, 250 words, pages rather, because I know if it's any longer, we do struggle to read through them, some more than others. So it was perfect in that regard as well. And yeah, 111 chapters. I've not seen a book with that many chapters before.
I don't think I noticed it. You know, when you said 111, I didn't realize.
Yeah, there's quite a few, but I mean, I wouldn't really call them chapters, but more like sort of entry points, I guess. But basically, but it was good to see though that you can again just throw the book out with regards to how long a chapter should be. It can be 2 pages long throughout the whole book and not be a problem. I've never seen that before, so that was quite good for me to see. But I was comparing it to his other book that I've read, and it's quite similar in the style that one chapter follows the other.
What was
and he's really The Art of Eloquence. But he's really good in the regard of he doesn't really, as a reader, because he understands that it can be quite a dry subject, and with all respect, people that study etymology or philologists are quite dry, I guess you would call it. But he doesn't make it that deeply. He just kind of gives you an appreciation. So as a layperson, you could read it and think, you know what, it spots my interest, and I think that was the beauty of it. That it does spot people's interest and brings etymology to a wider audience.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Zubair. How about you, Fahim? What did you think when you saw the cover and the title?
Yeah, I found it quite interesting, this gold and red cover.
Good interesting or bad interesting?
Yeah, good interesting, I guess. It looks a bit like my wallpaper to a degree. A lot of Indian restaurants that I've been to in terms of the interior.
Yeah, I was going to say, it looks like a bridal lehenga.
Yeah, exactly. There's so many things that, from our culture it reminds me of. Even like tapestries and so on. So there's many different things depending on your cultural upbringing as to what it can remind you of, which is interesting. The word I struggle to pronounce it, like Mehran said, I'm going with ETYMOLOGICON. But I think when I looked into it, I read more like when you look into Wikipedia articles, they have sometimes etymology. I don't know if you've noticed on Wikipedia. And then I thought, oh, right, that's where I've seen etymology before. Yeah. Not on all topics, but on certain things. And then obviously, I think it's everyone's described it, gives you a whirlwind tour, probably a cursory link and cursory examination of the words. You can't really go into much depth in 2 pages for a chapter, can you? But I think that's the nature of the book, is to go from one idea to another, but in a linked form, and then obviously coming back to the beginning at the end. So it does what it says on the tin. It clearly is etymology of words in the English language, and obviously because of the link to that and European languages and Latin, which I did for a couple of years, that there is obviously some background to where the words come from. But I think the more you learn about this and the deeper you get into this field, there's so many different countries that words actually lend their words to the English language. So that's something maybe we can touch upon. But yeah, I found it quite easy to read and accessible, and made me look into his blog as well. Obviously, it's based on the blog, and it's still updated, as we know. So there are still new blog pieces that come along. There's blogs for March and so on. So I found it really quite interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I think he's taken more of a sabbatical, hasn't he? There's not much coming on the blog in comparison to previously, but it's just really interesting from the point that he started the blog to actually getting the book published, which is 2 years for a first timer. He kind of defines that turn up definition right at the beginning of the book in terms of the unexpected winner in a race. So I thought it's quite an interesting book.
Brilliant. What did you like best about it, guys? How about you, Fahim? Shall we start with you?
Yeah, okay, no, that's fine. I liked the bit about botulinism and Botox and the link, just the medical hat on. I thought that was interesting. Even though I might know it's interesting how, if you were to tell the Hollywood stars that or someone, would they actually be interested in getting Botox, or obviously, and the amounts needed to cause that, and the way he linked many things. He talked about pandemic as well. There's a bit where pandemic. Yeah. So I found those 2 things most relevant to what I knew about, because a lot of the things that they're quite obscure sort of words. I'm not sure how the words got selected for the book, apart from being linked to each other. What led to one word being put in instead? It's not based on pronunciation or perhaps usage of word in the language. No. So, and there's no explanation. So I just found what I thought was most relevant that I knew about. And so I found those things most interesting to me.
That would be so interesting to find out how we try to link it. How about you, Zubair? I don't think.
I was just saying, with regards to what you were saying for him about you could not figure out how the different subjects were linked. I think probably when he says it's a circular stroll, that for me was probably the link for me, that he's just talked about one thing and then thought, okay, what word could follow from this word? And then he just linked, and I just walked through the different words that he could link together until he's come full circle back to the first word that he put us in the book. So I think for me, that's where that came from. It may be completely wrong, but that's just the impression I got.
Never ended.
Yeah. But you could, and the way he goes about it, you could probably argue you could probably end up writing this book forever and ever beyond 253, maybe even 2,500 words, pages rather. So I think it probably could have gone a lot longer than it did do. So I think that's probably the difference for me in that regard. I mean, I know you guys were saying that you've not really done much etymology before. Obviously, Mike is always asked all the time about different things. Where does that come from? Where does that come from? And that kind of does extend towards words. So we're actually talking about shell this morning out of interest, because my kids love shells, seashells, that sort of thing. I was just going to go about how the shell petrol won't get its name. There's another reason why I told them that, because that's more personal, and that probably isn't very flattering.
Well, that personal stories a bit. Why don't you give us a personal?
Yeah, that's
here. I might mention it off air, but that was basically me from. So yeah, sorry.
It's nice that the younger generation are interested in it, and like Fahim said, because obviously he picked words that panded to what he does in his daily life. So I think that's I don't know if it's a good selling point or what about the book, but basically it just goes to relate to everybody, anyone who picks this book up, if they're young or old or worked or not worked or in healthcare or the arts, everyone's going to love something about it, because it feels like, and it's quite conversational, so it's like he's talking to you. So let's get a bit negative. What do you not like about the book, Mehran?
Me, I think he kind of touched and crossed a couple of red flags for me, just in terms of when it comes to religion, putting, in terms of old and new Testament, and using alternative phraseology in terms of discussing that. I think that was difficult. But I acknowledge the reason why perhaps he had to do that, in terms of bringing in a wider audience, perhaps a more secular audience. But it's just, I found that distasteful. And there was a couple of incidents, and I think they were pretty much around religion, and perhaps a little bit around sexism as well. There's a lot of kind of references to females in a negative way, much disproportionate compared to males as such. So I thought that was quite negative and hard to swallow.
Yeah, it's just a bit jarring, isn't it, when it's flowing so nicely and you're just like, oh, that was a bit not politically correct or not respectful. Yeah,
because I think that happened at page 6 of the book, so it was right at the early on, so that just set the scene. And I guess the only way was up, wasn't it, after that? So
I guess so. Thanks, Mehran. How about you, Fahim? Is there anything that you didn't like particularly about the book?
Yeah, I think what Mehran said I was going to say, but yeah, I think there was just some unnecessary tension with the French as well in the book. I thought
that's very British though, isn't it? Like, he proper doesn't like the French. I know exactly what you mean.
I mean, is it really that sort of an English? I don't know what that's trying to do, because I think maybe in terms of a long time ago, obviously 1066, but that was a long time ago. I mean, I really build this in the 20, whenever this was written, a few years ago. I just felt that was just a bit distasteful, and some of the stuff Mehran said, and really just, I think, maybe in terms of world language, in terms of the different words across the world, I would have liked perhaps more from India, to have come into the book, which I know about. Unless I missed it, there's so much from India that's come in, pajamas and so on, isn't there? And I just felt that could have been, we could have missed out the stuff about the cats that were being shot by the archers and chickens and all this and gambling. And we could have actually put in some other things that would have given it a wider readership in the world. I think this is a book good for the UK.
Yeah.
But the English language actually is across the world, and and how much relevance will someone, when you're not talking about those words, find in South Asia and things. And I'm always interested in the longevity of a book in the world audience and who's interested. So that's just a bit, but that's just my personal view.
No, I think you're right. Yeah, I think especially I think this is a book. It's a bit propaganda-ish, just because Britain's been invaded so many times by so many different people, and he does sort of touch upon how words disappeared when one people were invaded by another people. But it just makes us look very successful in history, and there have been great tragedies in like the royal families and the wars and the battles and all sorts. We've got quite the tapestry of our history is very bloodstained. So maybe if one of us was to go into some sort of etymology, we'd probably find a bit more interesting words, because obviously after I went and read this book, I went and Googled so much of our own languages, as I'm sure a lot of you did, and it's just a bit biased towards the UK history. How about you, Zubair? Is there anything that you didn't like so much?
I think you made a really good point. He is rather flippant, isn't he, when it comes to religion? He doesn't really kind of take it seriously, and that's quite apparent in his phraseology there. And as Fahim mentioned, although he does dance around different words from other cultures that are not European, I think on the plus side, he does acknowledge them, and he doesn't sort of ignore the fact that there are a lot of words that maybe are not known to the masses, but do come from a variety of wider cultures. If you want to give it sort of the global appeal, then quite clearly there was a lot more they could have worked on. But I guess his audience probably is primarily a UK-based audience. I'd be surprised if he's looking at marketing this to somebody in Bombay or in Shanghai, Dhaka. I'd be surprised if he was, but he may do. I think for me, he comes across as being quite an old school Englishman in many ways, in terms of his prejudices and whatnot, if I can say that. The sort of, what would you expect really to have been the case 60, 70 years ago. But I don't think he means any harm by it. I mean, I could be wrong, but he seems to be that's just the way he is. And I think that shows his honesty with it. He doesn't sort of hide and say and sanitize the work. He's actually honest with it and gives us a reflection of maybe what he's thinking, or maybe what he was led to believe when he was younger. I think with the words, though, I think he does there's a serious aspect to his words, but there's also an element where he's quite flippant about things. But I think that's probably part of the charm as well, that he understands that language for most people is just a tool, and it's not something for study. And people don't really sit and think, where does that word come from, and how can I make this word better? Most people don't do that. The people that do would probably not read this book in the first place. They'd probably read more detailed books on etymology. But he's just marketing this for the laity, and I think that's probably where it falls down. That it isn't a serious etymology book, but it is probably a book that maybe works more towards inspiring the masses to be interested in it. And even those that maybe would be well versed in reading, letting them be aware that actually there's a science for etymology out there, and giving them the understanding that actually does exist.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's what. Sorry, go
No,
ahead,
I was just going to add to what Zubair was saying. Yeah, and I think he kind of backs it up with only a constellation of references, doesn't he? At the end, it's obviously not a science transcript or a kind of manuscript with, how he brings that information to suit his kind of explanation and narrative. Because we don't know where he's taken it. He's just, there you go. This is my study of books. It's from somewhere amongst there. So it's quite an interesting take to take.
Yeah, and like when you go deeper into the science, it's really difficult to find etymology of so much stuff, because obviously it's going to be a lot of oral traditions that are passed down. So when I was trying to find some words, like I'm a pharmacist, so I love finding out how to name a drug. I think that's one of the biggest mysteries in the whole of pharmacy, why they name them such weird things. So when I was trying to find out, it's so difficult to go back in time and back into the science. So I think he's got quite a privileged view that maybe he's holding on to, maybe for about 5-6 more books, and then maybe he'll tell us all our secrets. But it's just really difficult to get really stuck into the science itself, because it's totally sparked an interest in my heart, but I couldn't do anything with it after that. Did you guys have a favorite word? Can we start with Mara? Did you have one?
I had a favorite, well,
Passage.
section, I guess. Yes, passage. I guess this isn't just me being crude, but the one about concealed farts was quite humorous. The way it just comes out, and you know, I guess. Well, yeah, exactly. And
you don't get to criticize the earlier part of the
That was brilliant.
The way it just lingers in, you know, in the discussion. But yeah, I just feel sorry for all those Peters out there. But no, it's just I guess it just adds to his quirkiness. You just take from this book what you want to take, and it's good dinner table conversation in all honesty,
yeah, totally.
and at places. So I thought that was quite interesting. There's so many, but yeah, that really made me laugh.
Thank you. How about you, Zubair? Did you have a favorite passage? Zubair?
Reading through it, there were different bits that sort of sprung out to me throughout the book. And it was difficult to kind of pin down one. But when I read through it first time, the bit about pans did stick out for some strange reason. Just the fact that
I was going to say the same thing.
So I've linked your story, but the pans bit just stick out because I think there was a really good reference to something called Pantaleon and that sort of thing, and I thought that was quite a strange way to kind of bring together things. But I think the other thing was that he kind of, I didn't realize there were different kinds of pans and they kind of had different etymologies to them. But again, it just shows the quirkiness that actually you might think it means one thing, but actually means something very different. So even though the words sound quite similar, they've actually got very different roots, which again shows the richness of languages in many ways. I know Fame's going to mention the Botox thing, so I won't jump on that one, because again, that does stick out to me as well.
You've already done it, Zubair.
Sorry?
You've already done it. So.
So that's brilliant. Mine was antinoclasis, you know, the one where the words are repeated in the same sentence and it's just the same word and again and again and again, and it's a real sentence, because I think obviously being of South Asian heritage, we have a link to Arabic, and that's a big deal for us. And when I was studying A-level English, my A-level English teacher, shout out Mr. Pang, he had a Chinese background, so he told us how bad we are at Mandarin because everything's all intonation based. So the same noise just repeated in different intonations can mean a whole sentence, and if you mess up on the intonation like we do, because obviously our whole the air of the sentence is based on the intonation, whether we're angry or sad or anything. But if someone who's speaking Mandarin is angry or sad or anything, it's going to sound exactly the same, maybe a bit more forceful, but the intonation has to be there for it to mean the right thing. And I think that was my favorite bit. How about you, Fahim? Did you have a favorite one other than Botox?
I like that. Yeah, I like that. I like the food references in the book. Surprise, surprise. You know, naan bread and all this. You know, although naan bread probably wouldn't be two together because that's pretty bad to do. But the explanation of that was interesting, and obviously what sausage meat and the hot dogs, and obviously thinking how more just laterally about the content of how that relates to the food we eat, which made me think about the horse meat scandal of 2013 and what's in a doner kebab, and I was putting all of that things together.
Don't think about what's in a doner kebab, you'll never eat one again.
So all of that got jumbled in together in my head when I was reading that part. So it wasn't mainly just that, but what that made me think about, which I found interesting.
That's really cool. That's such a nice little context. Is there anything that surprised anybody about language in this book? And how did you like the cyclical style, like how he relates one word to the next? How about you, Zubair?
Well, his other book is quite similar in terms of he just leads one chapter to the next chapter. So I've only got two to go of. But from what I can see from both books that he's written, he does interlink each chapter to the other. And I quite like that style because it looks as though he's thought it through properly. As opposed to just thought, well, I'll end this here, then I'll start something very different next. So there's a logic to how he's proceeding, and he just sort of carry you through the different areas. Even though when you read the book, you could probably argue that some bits could follow other chapters a lot more logically as well. He doesn't really do that. He does meander slightly between different parts. I think that's quite a good thing with him. Because I don't think you see many books like that. I've not read many books that kind of follow that, unless they're historical narratives. So it's almost like a history book in some ways, the way he goes through it.
I know, that's brilliant. How about you, Mehran?
The cyclical nature, it was interesting. I think obviously that the rhythm of the book comes out in that way, but there was, I think, with your reference to, you know, the intonations and how words are pronounced and what it means, I think that was the only opportunity that within the book I felt that, you know, rather than just written and spoken word, there was no real reference to rhythm and rhyme, which you know, phonology throughout the whole book. But I thought I found myself, there were some subsections which they weren't as appealing. So, but it just felt I was obligated to continue that path to actually find out where it gets to. Because I guess
thought the same thing, that he's done it really well in terms of like marketing, because you cannot stop reading it.
Yeah. Like things like Cybermen, it just didn't interest me, but I just felt obliged to continue reading it. But yeah, it's I think that's probably what I'd say about the cyclical nature.
So is it the fact that you didn't enjoy the book because you couldn't skim it, in terms of you couldn't jump chapters and stuff? Is that is that a bad thing for the book to have? You can't get through it.
No, not really. I think every bit has to draw an interest, but it's because of the fact that his discussions are very topic based.
Yeah.
It's obviously going to be difficult to appeal 111 topics to the reader. So I guess there's an expectation. There's you know, there's a suspense. It's basically repetition, isn't it? He introduces, gives into narrative, and then.
But it's rare that you read the book and you actually read the whole book word to word, because other parts you might read. If any book think this is boring, I want to just skip this bit out. So I think that for me makes sense when you're saying that, because there are books you would read and think, okay, I don't need to know about this anymore. I just want to skip this chapter or skip this page out. So I think you're right there, because you couldn't really do that with this book easily. You could do, but then you think, how did it get here? Because you could link all the chapters together besides that.
Everything all the way through. Yeah, you can't cheat.
Yeah.
How about you, Fahim? What surprised you about language, and how did you find the way he's sort of linked every single word?
Yeah, I think obviously with the language, it's an obvious style that he keeps using with each chapter. Like I said at the beginning, it's sort of a cursory examination of a word and then a bit of his own narrative, and then before you know it, you're on to the next word, aren't you? Within 2 pages. So it was I guess in terms of language, it sort of felt a bit like Monty Python-esque sketches as he went along. He talks about Monty Python, but I just thought, hang on, have I seen a carry-on film about this or something? You know, some of the sort of things. It gives you that sort of a 50s vibe, actually, when you're going around 50 to 70s vibe. And I think that was a deliberate style of ploy. It's obviously popular to a section of the UK audience, not all, but that works for them. And obviously I think it was played in Radio 4, wasn't it, to begin with, and then obviously got written as a book. So nothing against Radio 4. I like Radio 4, but we know that's a serious audience. Yeah, it's you know, so you know what you're getting into, and I think that's what the sort of flow into the cyclical. I mean, he's just trying to link them all so it comes back at the end. But like I said at the beginning, I didn't know how he actually originally chose a word to come in, apart from I've got to get to the end somehow, because it's not based on world use, or if it is, not mentioned about usage in the language. But yeah, I think Mehran made good points about phonology. I mean, rhyme, rhythm, all of these would have been interesting, or even pronunciation. Focus on that. I don't know, because I also listened to the audible version as well, the audio version. And the audio version, yeah, I did as well, because I like sometimes just reading different ways.
I bet that was nice. It sounds like a written down podcast. How does it sound?
Yeah, so it's good, but it's but the person who does it, he sort of pronounces certain words wrongly that I think, unless I pronounce them wrong. So that was interesting. So like, yeah, so one of them was like, I think, you know, it's when you blush, and he talks about this erythema, and he's basically saying that's you blushing. But the person who reads it on the audio, he basically almost says it's like arrhythmia, and I'm like, did I hear that right? Not arrhythmia. So it's like, and
you're like the worst audience for that to happen to.
Exactly. So I was listening to this, I'm thinking, he didn't say arrhythmia. He did not say erythema, as it should be said. So you can tell when they're coming to words that they're not familiar with, like the first etymologicon, you know, whoever's actually reading the book out, and it's not the author who reads the book. They also struggle with certain words. So yeah, it's interesting. You either have come across the word or you've not, and if you haven't, then is trying to make it work. But I thought that was interesting.
They should have just read it out to him once. Just read it out and just be like, "Is this right?" Like we YouTubed it, didn't we, Mehran? We had a go at saying it. But it was an
Absolutely.
American pronunciation.
Yeah, and very robotic. Do you know?
Yeah.
It's just not normal.
It's not right. It was not the way I've been saying it for like 4 years.
But it's got thousands of views. You know, it's crazy. So
Maybe they're all reading his book. That's why it's a bestseller.
probably.
I've never seen the word used anywhere else except for this title. That's it. So apart from all of those things about the book, but what about language? What do we think about what brings longevity to a word? Maybe not its language, but the word in itself. How about Zubair? Because we've got a lot of words in. It's kind of unavoidable as well. They come from Persian, they come from Arabic, they come from Sanskrit in our English language. How do you think we preserve a word through language?
I guess the first question is, how is it first introduced into the language? So I guess from what he's saying there, a lot of these words were adopted from other cultures, whether it be Germanic tribes, whether they be from Persia or from India or whatever else it might be. But once they enter into the popular sphere and they've been written down and they've got traction within the people, I guess if the word has relevance, it'll always be there. So a rose will always be there because we'll always have roses in this country unless there's a major issue with the bee population.
We don't start flying.
Well, and for example, chess will always be a word, and checkmate will always be there unless there comes a stage when something more popular takes its place. But there will be examples of words that change. So there are words that we use now that were used differently 50, 100 years ago. So the words themselves can change their meaning, but also some words will no longer be in vogue. So I guess some words, for example, for the British ear, I guess in many ways, some of them that may have religious connotations, but by virtue of their faith not being a strong part of society anymore, will naturally die out or not be as well known because people won't hear them as much. So Whitsuntide and that sort of thing, people won't really know about it, whereas historically they would have been like a major part of the calendar. So I think that for me it's about fashions, but there's also, if that word is to do with something that has longevity, either because it's in nature, like the sun or the moon, or because it's being preserved by the powers that be, or the laity need that word to function, then I think it has traction. I guess you could argue that we don't use yards and meters, yards and inches anymore. You know, we're now supposed to be metric here and there, but that's still being used. But if you ask people about furlongs and that sort of thing, people not many will be aware of how long a furlong is, but they might know how long a mile is. But historically, everybody will know how much a grain weighed or how much a furlong was. But those words no longer have longevity to them because people know about grams and kilograms. So I think a lot of it depends on the culture and how it changes. I mean, with those, obviously, for those with an Asian language, so to speak, there'll always be words that will never die out because it's so entwined with the faith or with food. Like biryani will always be a word. It's never going to lose. We'll never lose biryani, will be. It'll always be a word for a lovely rice-laden meal. But other words will go because we no longer live in those climates and those environments, and we no longer use those things. So I think that'll probably change. But I think for English, obviously, I think if the word is, for me, it depends if it has got a basis in nature, if it's strongly cultural, or it's aristocratic, then I think you'll always stay there. But I think otherwise, you might find they move on from them.
That's really interesting. What about you, Maran? What do you think about that?
I think I'd still, just before we went on live, I talked about how this question still baffles me a little bit, just in the sense that I guess language, is it continuous or discontinuous? Is it just a continuous transmission of information and detail? And for me, language just feels as though it comes in many forms. It could be written, it could be spoken, it could be represented. So I guess, let's say, for example, biryani, if all the dictionaries with that word is deleted, there will be someone out there who knows exactly how to make it, and it will come back into vogue. So it's just the preservation. So same thing with, say, text. If you burn all certain books, there will still be enough there to preserve it and kind of continue that that tradition. So I think the language that he brings out, for me, I think it's really fascinating and interesting because it adds context and depth in terms of where a word comes from. But it's at the same time, how do you apply it now? And cultures change, slang changes, and I guess we'll talk about that shortly. But it's an evolution of language, and I think you have to capture it at all stages.
That's interesting. How about you, Fahim? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, it made me thought of the historical connotation. I don't know if you've all seen the Rosetta Stone, but obviously that was different languages which were the same thing and different languages. So whenever I think about origin of language, I think back to the Rosetta Stone, that we've got these artifacts which help us to understand. And in terms of longevity, I mean, he talks about there was a time before things were written down, about 6,000 years ago. And obviously, we then moved on to the paper-based system. And obviously, that was a big part of maintaining the language, wasn't it? When you wrote down things, then obviously you can actually preserve it. So to some degree, apart from the oral traditions, writing down seems to be key in preservation of language at a fundamental level. And then in terms of which words are preserved, I think that's just to do with power and dominance. As he says in the book, history is determined by the victor often. So therefore, they will have the narrative of the words which are then used for the rest of society and the rest of the world. So, and that's just geopolitical power, I guess, and not necessarily principle or value-based, just who won. So that helps. And obviously, I think just in terms of things that are just fashionable, we talked about, and that's to do with the society. Obviously, we've become a much more multicultural country, Britain, and that's changed over the last 100 years. And therefore, you will be expecting foods and other maybe urban language and urban words to be more commonplace, to actually reflect the society you're in, and even the language that's being spoken by the children as they grow up, and the adults and the office workplace. So these are some of my ideas as to what gives the longevity.
That's really interesting. I think you're right about the geopolitical power. Like in the last, I think we were talking off once about how in the pandemic, so many new words have just made it into our everyday, even colloquial. They've gone from being quite formal and unknown to being colloquial, so everybody just knows what they are, and everybody from like 2-year-olds to 80-year-olds knows what Zoom is and how to mute and all that sort of thing. And COVID was probably never in there either. So I think that's really interesting about the power, and I think maybe the sort of situation at the time. Something that interested me was, and I think Fahim mentioned it a while back, about how it doesn't talk so much about languages that are picturesque, stuff like Mandarin and hieroglyphs, stuff like that. So how do we think we could sort of supplement the learning that, if there is any, from this book to those kind of picturized languages? What do you think, Fahim?
I actually didn't have an answer to it. I just thought I was
well, it was a really good point made.
Just an observation. I just we give, because obviously we were brought up in that tradition of the written word, but we shouldn't look at the other cultures any less. That's all. My main point was, whether it's a different form or some of the languages in Africa or parts of South America and stuff, and some of the languages that are getting more obscure, just because they're not the phonetic style in the written English or written sort of method. Yeah, even Arabic managed it. It's not right to left, is it? It's probably, it's going the other way, right? So I mean, but it's still powerful. But that's again to do with geopolitical power, isn't it? So that's not across the board with all languages. I mean, I think the main thing is who's speaking it. That makes a big difference. So the Mandarin, because there's billions of people who are speaking this now. So learn the language, and there's a pressure upon me to learn it, and I feel that pressure so every day. So and that's what's going to happen if you're a top 10 language. There's a pressure for you to know the language, right? Yeah, especially if you go to that country. And so if that country then uses a symbol or some other thing, then it's more powerful and you'll have more interest in it. And if they're producing lots of works that are then getting across the world, then you're actually causing a sort of that's a soft power in a way in terms of the cultural power that you're actually conveying. So I think it'll just come with actually the importance of learning things in other things. I think from science, I say it's a drawback because when we do like searches on Medline and thing, I often put in English language and I miss out a lot of things. But that's because those are the studies that we think are relevant. But actually, if I was actually to be able to use other languages and so on, maybe that would make a difference. So it's more of an aid memoir for me to not think, well, yes, we use a sort of written script, but don't forget the other languages which don't use that. That's all.
Yeah, that's really interesting. How about you, Maran? Do you have any ideas or thoughts on that?
I guess with language, I think you have to come across it with a huge dose of humility and respect, and just not use it to use it in a condescending way or put someone down. I don't think you can own language, or you've got authority over it. And I think this book kind of educates the reader how different each word and its roots are. So it's a case of respecting the kind of and acknowledging the lineage, because everything kind of influences each other, and there's a lot of similarities than what divides. So I think I think that's probably what I'd have to say about that.
Thank you. How about you, Zubair? Do you have any ideas about more pictorial languages?
Yeah. To be honest, I didn't quite understand the question until he mentioned it right now as to what he actually meant. But it's a difficult one, because I think we kind of only understand what we understand because we've only been exposed to certain languages, all of us. But they're all phonetic, as you mentioned. I have not learned hieroglyphics or Mandarin or any of those sort of languages. Obviously, that's part of it because I live in Lancashire and don't really expose to that sort of thing usually, and I've not really traveled that far either. So it hasn't been something that's been on my radar historically, but it'd be good to see that perspective as well, because I'm sure there'll be something that they can bring and maybe make us understand a bit better about what their languages can bring to the table. Maybe one for the future, I guess, to see if we can bring somebody on who can really explain that in a bit more detail and give us an appreciation, because that's it'd be like that. I'd be keen to kind of understand a bit more about.
Yeah, I'd like to see how they aid learning as well, because maybe seeing the pictures changes the way your brain sort of processes the words, because obviously we don't have to use one letter for each bit of the word, and they can just use a picture for maybe a sentence or a phrase or something. It'd be so interesting to see how progression of learning and progression of students aids that, and if it helps in the opposite end of the lifeline, really. So when people from Britain, when they get dementia or Alzheimer's, some of them forget how to read and forget how to recognize letters and stuff like that. So it'd be interesting to see if people who are learning Mandarin and are studying those kind of languages see how their recognition of different pictorial depictions of words and sentences and situations, how that declines, or if it even does the way ours does.
I think we have to understand, Senna, that all these kind of pictorial representations is our kind of limited understanding of what they're trying to say. Totally. So I think that's where you need to go back to the culture, to its roots, to actually fully appreciate the richness of where it comes from. Because my 6-year-old's trying to write his name in Egyptian hieroglyphics for school. That was part of his homework. So. But it's just the hieroglyphics. Each letter has got a hieroglyphic, which doesn't quite make sense. There has to be more than that, because I don't think they base their language on English. English is just a few centuries old, really, if you think about it in comparison. So yeah.
Yeah, no, that's right, and that's what I think that's what I've always been interested in languages anyway. But this is the kind of book, and when we started this conversation about different languages, it just makes you want to learn them all, so you can understand where they've all come from and how they're so different. Because I think English is quite limiting as well, because we don't have a lot of aspects that at least even Punjabi or Urdu or Arabic have. So there's hundreds of languages out there. It'd be so interesting to see how they differ. So sorry, I'm just looking at my questions. Thank you. How does seeing a new word that has colloquial content, I think we sort of touched on this a little bit, but how do you guys feel when a new colloquial word that's a bit slangified enters into the dictionary? I said off air that I'm a proper snob about this. So in the beginning, I'm just like, oh, don't like it. It's not a word. But I'm also from the north, and I start using things really ironically, and it just becomes part of my idiolect. So I think I just need to get used to it. So how do you feel, Fahim?
Yeah, I mean, I don't mind. Obviously, I'd have to get taught what they are. I'm not even probably know what they are. So once I hear it a few times, then it makes sense. But I normally just ask someone like, "What did you say?" If I've not heard it, and then they'll explain that, and then I'll be like, "Okay, that's fine."
Yeah,
But
as a dictionary on speed dial.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I think that'd be good. But I think coming back to that point about this colloquial and things, I think one of the things that I do mind is like the negative connotation that black has become in some of the language. I'd say, like it's in his black heart, the black sheep, black fried. There's a lot of negativity, and I don't know. He does touch on the word black, but he doesn't mention the negativity that the English language associates to that compared to white. And I don't know if that was a colloquial thing or how that came about, but. And if you add that up with the whole BLM thing that happened last year and just general race sort of issues, I think that whole concept of the empire and the words and black and white and things isn't really touched upon this book. So although it's raw, it's sanitized to that extent that it doesn't want to go into that murky area.
I think if he tried, he'd be very brave.
Yeah, so I mean, he kept it quite safe in those areas, but those are the things that I see in terms of colloquially. It's trying to change the way you look at words so that they don't have any positive, negative connotations in that way.
Yeah, that's interesting. How about you, Isabel? What do you feel?
Well, every single word in English has come from another place. So I think it's hard to kind of say or argue that a word shouldn't enter the language, because practically every word that I can think about has either got a Germanic root, a Romantic root, or a Celtic root, or a non-European root to it. So, because that is, in essence, what English is, isn't it? It's just a hodgepodge of different languages that have been just put together, some more than others, granted, but that's what it is. That's, I guess, the strength as well of it, that it can absorb words from other cultures, but it has a mind of its own. So the language will only evolve if it does that. And so I think it's hard. I think the French can probably be a bit more snobbish about it because they've probably got stronger foundations for their language, and maybe the Arabic and others, I guess, could have a stronger argument to say, well, actually, that's not Arabic or that's not French. But I think in England, I don't think we can have the same level of incredulity with new words entering into the language, purely because every single word that we have, as he's shown quite eloquently, has come from another culture or another country. There isn't anything really native about English, if that makes sense. I think it's mostly come from others. Ironically, even though there's an island mentality of the peoples here, I think the language itself doesn't reflect that. It's quite cosmopolitan, quite global, which is one of the guidelines of the country itself, and one of the contradictions that I think you find within the nation, that actually, even though the people may at times feel rather guarded about things, that their language doesn't at all reflect that at all.
That's really interesting, actually. I didn't think about it like that, because English, the book itself unifies so many different nations and religions and cultures and histories and narratives, I think, because obviously he talks about how one person heard something else and they just ruined the pronunciation, and that's just how the word became a word in that new language. So I think that's really interesting, because like you said about Arabic, they have arguments about what's poetry and what's not poetry. If something rhymes, then it is. If it doesn't, then it won't be. And the Arabic language, I'm just using that because it's so concrete in its rules and its grammar, and it's so heavily studied. And obviously, like the Quran, it's not been changed since all those times. But even the King James Bible is being changed and translated so that someone like me could understand the English, whereas I'll have to learn that old school Quranic Arabic to understand what's in the Quran. We don't translate that into like modern conversational Arabic, so that's quite interesting as well. What do you think, Warren?
I think just in terms of colloquialism and bringing them into the mainstream discussion, I think it's funny because even when I was thinking, what's a recent colloquialism, and I thought of the word bloke. But the more I look into the word bloke, it's a Celtic word which just means large, stubborn person. But then there's a Hindi word called lok that means a man. So there is there is an etymological basis to that word. So it's so I think it's, you know, obviously these words must have emerged from somewhere. So so I'm all for it. As I guess it's a kind of representation of where the society is at there and then. So and especially if we think language as a continuous conversation or continuous form of transmission, then yeah.
Can you imagine what the Oxford English Dictionary is going to look like in about 10 years? There'll be a whole room full of books.
Yeah, no,
it's
absolutely.
like the BNF with all the drugs. I had to look at one from the 1960s and it was this skinny, and now it's just like an Argos catalogue. So I think this is my last-ish question. Did the stuff from this book, did it change your practice or how you approach language or the world in any different way? Should we ask Fahim?
Yeah, I think learning about different things like you know, the Chancellor of the Exchequer and Czech and stuff, that was, you know, obviously very new to me and very practical, because we get used to the red box and the checker and so on and all this, and it's just a really good thing for anyone to have read that book and learned that history. So in terms of knowledge, I think you can't go wrong with knowledge. So in that regard, I'm really happy with the book, and I learned new derivations. Whether they're right or not, like we said, we don't know. We take it as gospel, don't we, that it's correct, but we actually don't know if it's right or not. But let's say it is. Yeah, let's hope it is. Yeah,
I've repeated like the whole book to people in conversation, so
I found that, and you know, and obviously I took away his particular brand of humor. You know, like I said, which I thought was Monty Python-esque, you know, and I took that away from the book. And I think, like you said, it's a really good one for dinner parties if you want to say some anecdotes and things and come across clever. It's good. You just, you know, just a quick one-liner and so on after the dessert. Yeah, by the way, do you know where that dessert name comes from? So it'd be quite good, and you could learn something. So definitely, it's there's things to learn from this, which you ruminate on afterwards, which I've mentioned earlier in the program.
Thank you, Fahim. How about you, Zubair? Because I know you were already interested in the subject. So how has it changed any of your approaches?
I'm looking forward to the next time Fahim mentions where the word Nambread comes from at the dinner party, and it gives the people the background to it. It'd be good to see their reaction anyway. Yeah, good luck with that one. No, I think.
Do you know where the word samosa came from?
Is that like sambusa though?
I have no idea, but no, it's all a question actually. Does it make you think about other things? Well, you mentioned before, didn't you, about where pharmaceutical words come from and their roots. But we've obviously got, as medics, we have many medical terms, and if you ask yourself where does that word come from, you might well just Greek or just Latin. But actually, then there will be etymology behind it that actually explains why the Greeks use that word in their times. And I think when you do that, you realize actually the depth in our medical terms. But no, I think I'm all for it, because I think that the better you understand the language, the better you use it, and the better you can use other parts of language, whether it's speech, whether it's poetry, whether it's the written word, whether it's just the radio or TV. I think you've got a better grasp of it. I think it's also harder to be influenced in an adverse manner if you understand language. I think what we see nowadays is people being manipulated, I guess you could say, by certain parts of society. Which is not in their interest. And I think if they had a better grasp of language and the tools of eloquence and how language is used, they probably wouldn't be as quick to be manipulated, I think. So I think I'm all for it. I think we need to kind of make this a thing where people understand where the words come from, not just English, but I think even for our own cultural backgrounds, for those words, for other words that maybe we've learned from other languages. I think if you're at that level, I think you've really got a good basis, not just for the language itself, but also as an individual. And I think it's harder for you then to be swayed by arguments, because you can probably argue better than what you're being argued for.
Thank you. That was really interesting. How about Mehran? What do you think? Have you approached anything differently after reading this book?
I think it's fair to say we share a common podcaster, and then he, you know, in terms of my exposure to etymology was through him, Sheikh Hamza Yusuf. So it's, you know, one of the words that really sticks out is the word critic, which in Arabic stands for naqid, which is someone who can distinguish pure from gold. So it just makes me really understand and appreciate that, just because you have an opinion doesn't mean everyone needs to hear about it. And you try to influence within your zone of proximity. So I guess it's just in terms of valuing the context of a word, where that's come from, and appreciating, actually there was a great deal of wisdom that existed before, and that wisdom sometimes has been lost through the ages for various reasons. So it's just, so I think it's just the appreciation of it.
That's the thing. It's nice that you mentioned Sheikh Hamza Yusuf, because obviously he talks about etymology all the way through his lectures. That's why I think, I don't know, it's difficult for me especially to sort of articulate why I feel like this is important to know, like the source of words. But I think some of the most learned people that we see in history and in our present, they have such a beautiful grasp of language. Like Russell Brand, he speaks like his normal everyday prose is like poetry, and he knows where all the words come from, and he knows all the origins. And I just think maybe that's just where it is. Maybe it just is a bit of a power sort of move as well, because I like I said before, if I had a patient and I explained to them what Botox actually meant, where it came from and what it does, then maybe they wouldn't be so inclined to use it. Or something like digoxin, if it came from a flower, then they would be a bit more willing to try something that changes the beat of their heart, stuff like that. So I think it really makes the listeners sway towards your point. And that's all my questions. Thank you, guys. Shall we get a rating? Zubair, what do you rate it out of 5?
Oh, you're on mute, dude.
I'll give it a 4.5. Apologies. I'll give it a 4.5.
That's a really nice one. What about you, Fahim? What do you rate it? We thought we'd start at the top, but I didn't expect it to be so good.
Yeah, I don't know. I think I need to read this again. Solid 3 for me, which is, it's fine. Some of the crass stuff,
It's fine.
Yeah, it's fine. I took the effort to listen to the audio as well. So, I give it.
You did.
I gave it a good crack of the whip, didn't I? So I mean, 3 out of 5, and that's just because it's a certain type of humor involved, and at times slightly repetitive, and the crass humor at times, it can be a bit grating. So
yeah,
and possibly because I didn't learn that many new words, I felt a bit cheated as well. I would have liked to have learned 100 new words, and that sort of thing. So maybe that's why. Maybe for someone else who learned a lot more from it than it would be. But yeah, probably 3 out of 5 for me.
I think the audiobook knocked it down a solid half. So it must have been, would have started off 3.5, then you heard her say arrhythmia, and that was it.
And I thought, no, I can't be doing this.
How about you, Mehra? What do you give it out of 5?
I'm gonna go with a weak 3. So as opposed to a solid one. It's just, as it's there, it's palatable. Enjoyed it. So, but yeah, I'd probably go with that one.
That was cool, thank you.
What about you, Shannon?
Oh, I don't know. Back in the days, I would have given it a 5, and now this has destroyed so much stuff. So maybe a 4. But yeah, I'm saving my 5s for something that blows my mind. But yeah, I think it's a 4. I think, like you said, it is there, and it doesn't really change your life so much as basically it feels like it opened a door for me. And it didn't show me where to go. So I just want to know so much more about etymology, but there's nowhere else to go because he's got all the etymology in his head. But yeah, it's a 5. It's a 4 from me. I'm lying. It's a 4 from me. Next month's book, next month-ish. It's in May, because obviously you've got the little break. I'm very excited about this one. It's Consumed by Arifa Akbar. Fahim, do you want to talk about it a bit?
Yeah, so it's not out yet. So I only have the information that we all know that's publicly available. It's about Arifa Akbar and her sister, who sadly passed away from tuberculosis. So there's many themes, I gather: grief, tuberculosis, TB, going to a different country as well, and finding out roots. So that's my understanding. I've not read it yet, and it's not out yet. But I gather that's what it's about. So there's quite a few strands there for us to unpick, including medical, the human experience, as well as a few other things. And it's meant to be one of the most sought after and popular non-fiction books of 2021. It's in a lot of reviews I saw as well, which got me interested in this book. So I hope that we're able to have a good time in reading that, and it'll prove to be quite good. Obviously, we've got the break for Ramadan for next month, but hoping to continue every month otherwise. And yeah, thanks for the quick plug there, Mehrad. So we're doing just one of the MEDtalkx webinars coming on, roll up. What can I say? It's on faith and medicine. So it's a week on Wednesday, hoping to have doctors from different faiths talk about, I think, an often neglected topic in the public sphere, which is faith, although I think it can be quite personal to people. But I think for some people, it's also a public display as well. And maybe we can find some themes to do with how public it should be, how personal it is, things we can learn from faith, end of life. There's so many strands that we can tease out on the night, and we're happy to take questions, but that should be quite an interesting talk, and something I'm looking forward to. April the 7th.
Thank you. That's everything from me. I don't know if anybody wants to add anything else.
No, just thank you, Sana, for choosing the book and chairing this discussion.
Thank you, Sana.
Thanks, Sana. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Take
It's
care.
been brilliant.
Bye.
Bye.